They were quite an ordinary couple, ordinary, though a touch combative, the Bondels. They often quarreled over trifles, but soon made peace again, as if nothing had happened. In the past, Monsieur Bondel had been engaged in trade. Once he had accumulated enough to live in comfort, according to his modest tastes, he gave up business, rented a small house in Saint-Germain, and settled there with his wife. He was a man of balance, with firm, long-established convictions. Having received a decent education, he read serious journals, yet still valued Gallic wit. Possessing a logical mind and sound common sense, the chief virtue of a shrewd French bourgeois, he did not think much, but was firmly convinced of the correctness of his judgments and never made a decision until he had found reasons whose certainty his instinct confirmed. In appearance he was of middle height, with a touch of grey that inspired respect. His wife, despite many admirable qualities, had her faults. Quick-tempered, blunt to the point of harshness, sometimes even despotic, she was marked by obstinacy and a tendency to bear grudges. Once she had been quite pretty, but with time had grown stout and overly ruddy. Still, in their quarter she was considered a handsome woman, healthy, proud, and striking. Their quarrels almost always began at breakfast over some trifling cause and dragged on until evening, or even the following day. Their life was simple and monotonous, so every trifle became an event, every conversation a pretext for dispute. It had not been so before. Their common business had occupied them both, uniting their thoughts, bringing them close, as if binding them in a net of cooperation and shared interests. In Saint-Germain they had almost no acquaintances. They were forced to build new connections, to create among strangers a new, idle sort of life. The monotony of it soon wore on them, and they began to irritate one another. The quiet happiness they had counted on never came. One June morning, as they sat down to breakfast, Bondel asked, "Do you know the family that lives in the little red house on the corner of Berceau Street?" Madame Bondel, it seemed, had woken in a bad mood. She replied, "I do, and I don't care to." "Why not?" "They make a pleasant impression." "Precisely for that reason. This morning on the terrace I met the husband, and we walked 2 circuits together." Sensing tension in the air, Bondel hastened to add, "He came up to me himself and struck up the conversation." His wife shot him a disapproving glance. "You'd do better to avoid such encounters." "Why?" "Because there's gossip about them." "What sort of gossip?" "The usual sort." Heavens! Bondel made the mistake of answering with a trace of irritation. "You know perfectly well, my dear, I cannot stand gossip. The moment I hear ill spoken of someone, he immediately wins my sympathy. And this family pleases me greatly." She flared up. "Perhaps the wife as well?" "Yes, the wife too, though I barely looked at her." The quarrel grew more heated, for there was no other subject at hand. Madame Bondel stubbornly refused to say what rumors were circulating about the neighbors. She hinted at something shameful, yet declined to explain. Bondel merely shrugged and chuckled, which exasperated her all the more. At last she burst out, "Well then, that man's been made a cuckold. There you have it." Her husband replied calmly, "I don't see why that should lessen his worth." She was aghast. "What you don't see? You don't see? That's too much. It's a public disgrace. If a man's been cuckolded, he's dishonored." He answered, "Not at all. Does a man lose his honor if he is deceived, betrayed, robbed? Certainly not. I'll grant you that infidelity disgraces the wife, but never the husband." She flew into a rage. "Infidelity disgraces them both. It is shame. It is scandal." Bondel, still perfectly calm, asked, "But first of all, is it true?" Who can say, if no lovers have been caught in the act? Madame Bondel shifted restlessly in her chair. What? Who can deny it? Everyone, absolutely everyone. It's the only thing people talk about. Such things are plain as day. Everyone knows, everyone discusses it. There can be no doubt. It's as clear as the sun at noon. Bondel smiled faintly. For centuries, people believed that the sun revolved around the earth, and they accepted as truth countless tales just as familiar and just as false. And that man, by the way, absolutely adores his wife. He speaks of her with such tenderness, such respect. Nonsense, all of it. Madame Bondel stamped her foot and hissed. He suspects nothing, that fool, that duped imbecile. Bondel did not grow angry, he reasoned calmly. Forgive me, but that gentleman is not a fool. Quite the contrary, he struck me as a man of delicacy and intelligence. And you won't convince me that an intelligent man would fail to notice what happens under his own roof, while neighbors in other houses miss not the smallest detail. Surely they haven't overlooked anything, have they? Suddenly, Madame Bondel was seized by a fit of feverish laughter that grated on her husband's nerves. Ha ha ha. All husbands are the same, every last one. Not one of them ever notices until he's rubbed in it. The argument veered from its starting point. Now they were debating the blindness of deceived husbands. Bondel doubted, Madame Bondel insisted, and her scorn grew more personal, until at last her husband grew irritated. A furious quarrel flared up, the wife defending women, the husband defending men. He dared to declare, "Well, if you ever tried to deceive me, I swear I'd find out at once. And I'd cure you of the desire so thoroughly no doctor could get you back on your feet." She flared with rage and shouted straight into his face. You! Why, you're as much a fool as all the rest. Do you hear? He replied calmly. I swear to you I am not. She burst into laughter with such brazen insolence that his heart contracted and a shiver ran over his skin. He said for the third time, I would find out. She rose, still laughing. No, that's too much, she flung at him. And she left the room, slamming the door. Bondel remained alone, in ill humor. That mocking laughter had struck him like the bite of a venomous fly, at first barely felt, but soon burning with intolerable pain. He went out of the house and strode down the street, deep in thought. The solitude of his present life fed melancholy reflections, a tendency to see everything in a darker light. Suddenly the neighbor he had met that morning appeared. They shook hands and began to talk. After touching on several topics, the conversation turned to their wives. It seemed both men had something to unburden, vague, uneasy reflections about those to whom their whole lives were bound. The neighbor said, You know, sometimes it seems as though they are hostile to their husbands simply because they are husbands. I love my wife. I love her dearly, I value her, I respect her. And what then? At times she behaves with our friends far more freely than with me, and more trustfully. Bondel at once thought, so it's true. My wife was right. When they parted, he was lost in thought. Irritation and contradiction swirled within him, while in his ears still rang that malicious, defiant laughter, which seemed to say, Yes, the same has happened to you as to all the rest, you fool. Of course it was bravado, the insolent bravado of a woman bent on wounding, humiliating the man she had angered. So this poor fellow too was a deceived husband, like so many others. He had said sorrowfully, At times she behaves with our friends far more freely, more trustfully, than with me. That is how a husband, the sentimental blind man whom the law calls spouse, puts into words his wife's preference for another man. And that is all. He sees nothing more. He is like all the rest. Like all the rest. And Bondel gave a strange, nervous laugh, just like his wife's. You too, you too. How careless, how reckless these women are, if for the sake of a single thrust they will awaken in a man such tormenting suspicions. He began to turn over in his mind the episodes of their life together, recalling old acquaintances, trying to remember whether his wife had ever behaved with anyone in particular with marked ease or familiarity. He had always been so calm, so confident in her, that he had never suspected anyone. But yes, there had been one man. A close friend, who for nearly a year had come to dine with them 3 times a week. Tancred. Dear Tancred, good Tancred, whom Bondel loved like a brother, and with whom he continued to meet secretly after his wife had quarreled with him for some unknown reason. Bondel stopped, staring anxiously into the past. Then disgust rose within him, disgust with himself, with those shameful thoughts whispered by the jealous, suspicious self that lives in each of us. He began to scold himself, to feel ashamed, to reproach and accuse himself, yet still the memories returned of that friend's visits, of the esteem in which his wife had once held him, and of the sudden, unexplained dismissal. But then other recollections came of similar ruptures born of Madame Bondel's vindictive nature, which never forgave an offense. And he laughed at himself in relief, laughed at the melancholy that had begun to gnaw at him. And remembering his wife's spiteful expression when he had once said, coming home, "I met Tancred today, he asked after you," Bondel grew entirely reassured. She would always answer, "If you see that gentleman again, you may tell him to keep his concern for me to himself." Oh, what irritation, what anger sounded in those words. Plainly, she had not forgiven, and never would forgive. And could he have suspected her, even for a moment? Good God, how absurd! And yet, why had she taken such offense? She had never spoken of the real reasons, never explained the cause of her long-standing anger. And angry she was. Bitterly so. Could it be? No, no. And Bondel resolved, to indulge such thoughts was to debase himself. Yes, he was debasing himself, but he could not help thinking. And with dread he asked himself, had these sudden thoughts now lodged in his soul forever? Had a tormenting, constant doubt been born in his heart? He knew himself, he had always been the same, chewing over his uncertainties as he once pondered his business deals endlessly, day and night, weighing every for and every against. He was growing agitated, striding ever faster, losing his habitual self-possession. Before thoughts a man is powerless. They are elusive, impossible to banish, impossible to destroy. Suddenly a bold, almost reckless idea came to him, so daring that at first he doubted whether he had the courage to carry it through. Every time he met Tancred, the man invariably asked after Madame Bondel, and Bondel would answer, "She is still angry." And nothing more. My God! Could it be that he himself was one of those blind husbands? Perhaps. And so he resolved, he would take the train to Paris, call on Tancred, assure him that his wife's strange anger had subsided, and bring him back that very evening. Yes, but what an expression would appear on Madame Bondel's face. What a scene she would make. What rage, what scandal. Well, so much the better, it would serve her right. He would avenge himself for that malicious laughter, and in the moment of sudden reunion read the truth on both their faces. He went straight to the station, bought a ticket, and boarded the train. But as soon as it started and began descending the slope of Le Pec, fear of his own scheme gripped him, his head swam. To prevent himself from retreating, from surrendering, from returning alone, he tried not to think of his purpose. He distracted himself, humming little songs and operetta arias, anything to keep from reconsidering. When he reached the familiar street that led to Tancred's house, He suddenly longed to postpone the encounter. He lingered before shop windows, examined novelties, compared prices, even decided to drink a beer, something quite unlike him. As he neared his friend's house, he almost hoped not to find him at home. But Tancred was there, alone, reading. At the sight of Bondel he sprang up, exclaiming, "Ah, Bondel! What a surprise! How delightful!" Embarrassed, Bondel replied, "Yes, my friend, I had some business in Paris, and thought I'd look in on you. How kind of you! Especially since you seem to have grown unaccustomed to visiting me. What can one do? A man, you know, is susceptible to influence. And my wife, she seemed rather angry with you." "Seemed? Why, she was more than angry, she turned me out of doors." "But why?" "I never understood. Trifles, foolishness. We argued, I contradicted her." "About what?" "About a certain lady. Perhaps you've heard, Madame Bouton, a friend of mine." "Ah, that explains it. Well, excellent. I believe my wife is no longer angry. This very morning she spoke of you quite cordially." Tancred started, as if struck, and for several seconds could not find his voice. At last he asked, "She spoke of me, cordially?" "Yes." "You are certain?" "Of course. I did not dream it." "And then?" "And then, when I came into town, I thought it would please you to know." "Indeed, indeed." Bondel hesitated, as if wavering, then said, "I even had a thought, rather an unusual one." "What thought?" "To bring you home with me to dinner." Tancred, a cautious man, showed visible unease. "Oh, are you sure? Is it possible? Wouldn't it be awkward?" "No, no, I assure you. You see, you know well. Madame Bondel bears grudges." "Yes, but I am convinced she no longer harbors anger. She will be glad to see you unexpectedly." "Really?" "Certainly." "Well then, let us go, dear fellow. I am delighted. This quarrel has grieved me greatly." Arm in arm they set off toward the Gare Saint-Lazare. On the train both were silent. Each was absorbed in his own thoughts. They sat opposite one another, saying nothing, yet each noticed how pale the other had grown. At the station they again took one another's arm as if uniting before a common peril and, slightly out of breath, stopped before the Bondels' house. Bondel let Tancred go in first, followed him into the drawing-room, and called the maid. "Is Madame at home?" "At home, sir." "Please ask her to come down." "At once, sir." They seated themselves in armchairs and waited, though both longed to escape before the formidable figure appeared. Familiar footsteps, heavy, resolute, sounded on the stairs. The men saw the brass handle turn. The door opened, and Madame Bondel halted on the threshold, scanning the room. She glanced, started, blushed, stepped back, then froze, clutching the doorframe. Her cheeks burned. Tancred, pale as if about to faint, leapt to his feet, dropping his hat, which rolled across the floor. "My God, madam, it is I. I ventured. I was so wretched," he stammered. She said nothing. He went on. Will you forgive me?" And suddenly, as though impelled by some unseen force, she approached and held out both her hands. Tancred seized them, clasped them tight, would not let them go. She spoke softly, trembling, with a quiver in her voice such as her husband had never heard. "Ah, my dear friend. I am so glad." And Bondel, watching them, turned cold as though doused in icy water.